So that's why we're here tonight, to learn a little bit about the Underground Railroad in Sullivan County and unearth that story. We did bring some materials from the library in the back tonight for you to look through. We can't check them out to you tonight, obviously, but if there's something that interests you there, please come visit us in Due Shore and check it out then. Tonight's program is brought to you through funding a grant through the United Way that comes to us through the Friends of the Sullivan County Library. So that's how we were able to be here tonight with Gavin. Just another little plug for a program coming up this week. We have Melanie Norton from the Sullivan County Historical Society coming to the library on Wednesday, and she's going to be talking about genealogy research. So if that's something that's interesting to you, come see us on Wednesday. And we're here tonight with Pastor Ross. Did you want to say anything?
It's officially 6 o'clock. I was talking with Gavin earlier, and it's really appropriate that we're here for the Underground Railroad. This church and the Millview Wesleyan Church were originally part of a 6-point charge, and the folks here broke away from what would be the Methodist Episcopal Church at that time over the issue of slavery in like 1843-ish, and started congregations, and as they got the money, they built the buildings. So we celebrated the 120th of this building a couple years ago, but our denomination, and really here, is one of the first churches to really break away and form the Wesleyan denomination, again, over the issue of slavery. So it's great to have you all here. We're excited to host you there. There's cookies and ice cream downstairs afterwards. Afterwards, Pastor Bob. And I did turn the air conditioning up just a minute ago. The fans are zooming away to hopefully cool you off a little bit more. But I'm going to sit down. I'm anxious to hear what Gavin has to share with us.
Thank you, and this is Gavin Sigfried, also from the Historical Society in LaPorte, and all the great fun historical things in the county. So without further ado, Gavin, take it away.
Thank you, guys. As you've been told, I'm Gavin Sigfried from the Sullivan County Historical Society Museum. I am their community outreach coordinator, so my job is to come out and do stuff like this. I also manage their social media page, among other volunteer commitments that I have. And so I do stuff like this so I can say, afterwards or during, go to the museum, visit the museum, please enjoy our museum. It's a wonderful resource that we have here in Sullivan County, and it's packed to the brim with artifacts and information. So if you have not made a visit, make a visit, and if it's been a while, make a visit, or if you were just there, make a visit. But it's always worth your time to go there. And so tonight is brought to you by the Sullivan County Library. Melanie reached out to me, she said, could you do an Underground Railroad presentation? And I said, I probably can, yeah, why not? And then she said, this is our theme for the summer, it's unearthing a story. And as soon as she told me the theme for the summer, I was like, wow, this couldn't be better. Because I didn't ever really expect to unearth this story. A couple years ago, well, about 2 years ago, I started doing some volunteer work for the Endless Mountains Heritage Region. I'm now on their board. And Kane Chamberlain, the director of the Heritage Region, came to me and he said, do you think we could put together some historical walking tours on the Underground Railroad in Sullivan County? And I was in the middle of planning a summer of like 13 historical presentations for last year, and I was like, I don't think that there's any way I can do that. And then this year, I start seeing all of the hullabaloo that was drummed up by the Endless Mountains Heritage Region doing these walking tours on the Underground Railroad, and I called Kane and I said, Kane, how do I get Sullivan County involved in this? And Kane said, well, you told me no, so are you saying yes now? And I was like, oh, it's my fault we're not involved in this. And so I started to do some research, and I was really happy with what I found. I didn't think I was going to find much because the Underground Railroad was clandestine. And so being able to start unearthing some information at all was a surprise. The amount of it was even more surprising. And so the unearthing a story here is the actual story itself. I didn't know how much information was here. I've always loved history, so even in high school, when I was talking to locals and I was like, what about the Underground Railroad? I would get little tidbits of information, just enough. Well, the Genesee Road, well, the Quakers, just enough for me to be like, okay, well, we probably had some Underground Railroad here. I'd heard some of the bigger names in LaPorte brought into the category of Underground Railroad, potentially conductors or agents. And what I've since found is that LaPorte probably didn't actually have an active Underground Railroad, which was somewhat disappointing because I'm a LaPorte guy and I love LaPorte, so I was really hoping to find that information there. I think there were some very fervent abolitionists in LaPorte. They probably were even so fervent that they were providing monetary aid or clothing or food. But to be active in the Underground Railroad, you didn't want to be where the seat of justice was. You didn't want to be right next to the sheriff's office. And that's some of the houses in LaPorte. I mean, all the houses in the town of LaPorte are right next to the sheriff's office in their own way. And so I'm not 100% convinced of the Underground Railroad going through LaPorte, but I am 100% convinced that it went through Sullivan County. And so, early Sullivan County, before 1800, we had one road. From 1793 to 1800, we built one road through Sullivan County. That was the Genesee Road. And so the Genesee Road ran from the Muncie area all the way up to Towanda and then beyond. And it was built to open the Genesee Valley of New York, which was a very fertile farmland and very desirable place for new settlers. And so the Genesee Road came from the Highland Lake Tivoli area of Lycoming County through and around sort of Shrewsbury Township and up what's now present-day Ogdonia Road. And then connected with Hillsgrove and went up past Hillsgrove and then followed Elk Creek Road. And Elk Creek Road deposits us right here. And then it kind of split in a couple of different ways, but the primary route took it all the way up through and then towards Towanda. And so that early road that was here by 1800 was sort of our main highway on that side of the county. And it wasn't until 1808 that the Berwick Turnpike was built. So about an 8-year gap between this road and this road. And you can imagine early Sullivan County is just 2 roads and nothing else in this time period. Even opening a farm during that time, there were only 2 or 3, well, there were 3 or 4 farms opened before 1800. And so the Genesee Road, like I said, kind of came all the way up through and then off this way. It's important to the Underground Railroad because the McCarty family came up from Muncie and settled in Shunk, using the Genesee Road to get there. And so this is sort of our main road through the area. Ellen McCarty and Joel moved up into Sullivan County, and they were the ones who started the Quaker Church, what is now the Elkland Friends Meeting House. And Ellen and Joel were very, very active Quakers. And they were traveling all over, Ellen especially. She was the one who became sort of a Quaker pastor and rose up through the ranks. And she went to Canada and New York and all sorts of other places that were also very involved in the Underground Railroad. And so what we see with Ellen McCarty is that she's an active Quaker and she's traveling around a lot because of that. And she's also preaching in a whole bunch of different areas. She's going from Muncie to Igglesmere, early Igglesmere, Lewis Lake, and preaching up in Elkland Township. And so she and her husband Joel sort of helped organize the Elkland Friends Meeting House. And over time, that meeting house became a station for the Underground Railroad. And we think Ellen was an agent. Now, the Underground Railroad was split up. You've got a conductor conductors were just like you would expect a conductor on a train today. They sort of were in charge of ushering you from one stop to the next. And that was their only job. A station agent would have been managing the conductors underneath them. And so the agent was the next level up, and they were sort of the grand organizer. Churches were our intelligence apparatus for the Underground Railroad. And so a pastor who was in Forksville one day, and then up in Elkland Township the next day, and then over in Shunk the next day, he was the one who was probably bringing the information about, you know, the slave catchers or law enforcement on tails. And so that preacher would have been preaching on Sunday, and then after church, he would have gone to somebody that he knew was involved, and he would have said, don't have a group come to your house this week. Like, we know that there's law enforcement, send them that way. And that's sort of how the intelligence got spread. And we know that some churches were really, really creative with how they actually spread their intelligence. They would pick certain hymns through the church service, and those hymns could be the code that got deciphered through the church service by the agent that was then used to act for the next week. And so the intelligence apparatus of the Underground Railroad was as important as the actual conductors and moving slaves. So through Sullivan County, we know we had Ellen and Joel McCarty up there in Shunk, and we know that they were moving fugitive slaves. We also have evidence of people from Hillsgrove, the Snell Farm, and the Huckles from that area were probably involved. I've read some excerpts that were really cool. There was a couple old ladies, two old ladies that had owned a farm. I think their last name was White or Black. It was a color. And they owned the farm, and they had a young neighbor who would come check on them. And the young neighbor discovered that they were helping fugitive slaves, and lo and behold, he got involved and started helping too. And so we do know that there was a pocket in Hillsgrove and a pocket in Shunk. We also know that fugitive slaves couldn't really travel more than 8 to 16 miles. They were traveling only at night. They couldn't travel during the day everywhere. Montoursville was a bit of an exception. Montoursville was so pro-slavery as an entire community that the fugitive slaves would sleep openly in the fields during the day and then leave at night, and nobody seemed to bat an eye at all. But that wasn't the case everywhere. And so the fugitive slaves were traveling at night. You can imagine walking 8 miles at night through Sullivan County. Has anybody traveled Ogdonia Road recently? Imagine hiking it at night and not being allowed to touch the road, because the road was dangerous. There might be other travelers, and you're a fugitive, so you have to stay off the road, but close enough where you know you're along its path. And so you're playing a pretty strange game. So what we're going to do here is we're going to imagine that we were all fugitive slaves. We're a big group, all right? And we are leaving from the Maryland area. We got lucky enough to make it to the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland, and now we're being ushered north. There was a guy from Williamsport. His name was Daniel Hughes, and Daniel Hughes was a lumber guy, and he had rafts. So he would take rafts, lumber barges, down the Susquehanna all the way to the Chesapeake Bay, and he would drop off the lumber. Well, most guys would go fill their barge up with other goods and then bring those goods back north with them and sell the wares. But Mr. Hughes didn't do that. Mr. Hughes brought the empty barges back up, filled with fugitive slaves. You didn't take the whole group that you picked up to the same place. So all along the Susquehanna River, Mr. Hughes would be depositing small groups. You're a family of 5, you get off at Lancaster. You're a family of 6, you get off at Harrisburg. You're a family of 4, you get off at Sunbury. And those smaller groups would then find different routes to get north to New York and then Canada. Canada was the goal. It wasn't New York, it wasn't Pennsylvania, it wasn't just out of the slave states. It was Canada. In Canada, slavery was completely illegal. And so if you got to Canada as a black man or black woman, you got your freedom papers. There was no slavery in Canada at all. So that was beneficial to people who had left their family behind, because then they could potentially have an out if they got caught when they were trying to get their family back north with them. And so if they got caught again, they could say, hey, I have papers. They'd be Canadian legal papers. And they weren't always accepted. 1850 was when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, and that meant every single person who was a U.S. citizen was obliged to report or detain a slave. And so that meant if you thought for 1 second that somebody who was of color and was in your neighborhood that you didn't know was a slave, you were allowed to report them, and they would have to go to court to hash out whether or not their legal papers were legal. And a lot of times they would just get sent back because the judges up here didn't want to meddle with Southern business. And so they would say, just send the person back, and if their owner really didn't free them, then they'll come back north again. But if their owner didn't free them, then they were, back in bondage. And so the slaves were continuing to get dropped off throughout the Susquehanna River Valley, and they would get dropped off in, Montoursville, Williamsport. Pennsdale was a very active Underground Railroad hub. There are multiple houses in Pennsdale that have been verified as Underground Railroad houses. And also, the Quaker Church in Pennsdale was connected to the McCartys. They were, before they set the church up here, they would hike that 20 miles down to Pennsdale to have their Quaker meetings down there. And so the Quakers of Pennsdale were closely connected with the Quakers of Shunk, and Fox Township is named for the Quakers. So they would kind of send them up the Genesee Road to other places that they knew. So from Huntersville, they would stop at a man named Abraham Webster's house, and he would keep them for the day. One of the parts that I found awesome about Underground Railroad was your trip. If you were the fugitive slave, you were expected to have nothing by the people who were hosting you. And so you would get clean clothes, food, water, anything that you needed to get you from their house to the next station, they provided to you, and only enough to get you from here to there. Because they were trusting that the next group was going to take care of you from there to the next spot. And so Abraham Webster would have set these guys up with enough food and water for them to hike the Genesee Road down through the Ogdonia Valley and up into Hillsgrove, where they would have stopped at what's now Becky's Ice Cream. And they would have gotten set up from Hillsgrove. They would have slept during the day, probably in a corn silo or a tunnel, or maybe hidden out in the woods wherever they had a good spot. And then they would have woken up at night and been sent to the next stop. So while I was with the Endless Mountains Heritage Region, we were driving the Genesee Road, and we were sort of stopping along the way. And we stopped here in Lincoln Falls. And EJ, who was with me, EJ Murphy and Kane Chamberlain, EJ is the Underground Railroad expert. He was looking around and he says, "This community is perfect." And I said, I agree, it's in Sullivan County. But what makes it perfect? And he was like, for the Underground Railroad. And I was like, okay, great. I thought that's what you were talking about. I said, what makes it perfect? And he said, look at all these roads that combine right here. He said, this town is just an intersection. He said, there's probably 4 or 5 different roads that come in. And I said, yeah, you're right. He said, they all come from different directions. This is the exact type of place that an underground station would have existed, and probably did, across the street at the Morgan Century Farm. And when I say probably, I want you guys to know, I say probably to cover my own butt. I'm a historian, and I know that the information that's been passed on to me may be incorrect. So I always add those probablys to cover myself. Because if somebody else was wrong and I'm quoting them, that doesn't make me wrong, that makes them wrong. So, and I like being right. That's my girlfriend. So he's looking around and says, this place is perfect. He said, there's 5 or 6 different roads. So if a fugitive slave came in from one way, and then the slave catchers came in after them, that fugitive slave could have left by any number of these roads here. And the person who was giving the slave catcher the information could say, oh yeah, no, they went up Kobe Road, when they didn't. And it would be 2 or 3 days before that slave catcher had any idea how long they were, or why, or where those slaves went from here. And so Lincoln Falls was one of the more perfectly situated parts of Sullivan County. A part I did forget to attack here, but Sullivan County was formed in 1847. It was founded by Michael Myler. Michael Myler was a staunch Democrat. The Democrats were the ones that were for slavery and against the Civil War. And so Sullivan County from 1847 until 1861, when the war broke out, Myler was one of the leading men of Sullivan County, and another was Judge Jackson from Dewshore. Both of them were staunch Democrats. And so Sullivan County at the time, when the Civil War broke out, we didn't even have a draft office. If you wanted to serve in the Civil War, even to be drafted in Sullivan County, you had to go to Bradford County. That's why a lot of the guys from Sullivan County served in the Pennsylvania 141, which was the Bradford County Regiment. It's because if you wanted to serve, and you were with that first round of guys, you had to go to Bradford County to enlist to serve in the Civil War, because Sullivan County was strongly Democrat. And also, at the outbreak of the Civil War, we had on North Mountain Copperhead Camp. And so that was Civil War draft dodgers. So we know Sullivan County was not all for the Union and was not for dissolution of slavery. It was just as split as the rest of the United States at the outbreak of the Civil War, which simultaneously ended the Underground Railroad. Because if you were somebody who was going to help the Underground Railroad, you enlisted and served in the Civil War, because the same end, just a different way of achieving the goal. And so, if you've been on Ogdonia Road, right in this area here where it crosses the Sullivan County line, you can see North Mountain. And so I like to think about that moment for these fugitive slaves, that you're walking up that mountain and you're looking over, and now of course the Civil War is still a couple of years off between 18, but so that section of Sullivan County was very democratic and very conservative. And so here you are, right here, looking at North Mountain, and I said, you might have thought you were safe being north of the Mason-Dixon line, but then as you hike through Sullivan County and the political realization occurs to you that no, the people around here aren't all for abolition. There's a lot of people here who are pro-slavery. I think that must have been pretty scary. And I had that moment while I was looking from that section on Ogdonia Road over, and I was like, man, that's how close they were. That's how close they were to just absolute danger. The worst case scenario is running into somebody who wants to turn you in. And here in Sullivan County, you had that. So, that moment and that political division, we're still pretty divided. I think we're less divided today than we were in 1847 when we were first founded. But that, 1850 when the Fugitive Slave Law was passed and the Underground Railroad was at its height, Sullivan County was, not even an infant baby. It was still a newborn baby. And here now you've got this big political situation that's threatening to rip Sullivan County completely apart, just like it is the rest of the nation. And through the 1850s, we have this very active network of the Underground Railroad, but then we also have this very active political network of Democrats who are largely in charge of Sullivan County. And so I think that dichotomy is important to explore, especially in this subject of the Underground Railroad. So after getting to Lincoln Falls, the fugitives would have had choices, so to speak. You didn't necessarily have to follow the Genesee Road to Towanda. In fact, Canton had a lot of of abolitionists, and there was probably at least one or two agents and stations in Canton as well. And so going from here, you would go up towards Shunk and then out. There was another route through Lycoming County that came up Ellington Mountain Road, and so that puts you through just a little tiny chunk of Sullivan County too, but it's the same chunk. And that's one of those things that really struck me was it's all Shunk, man. Shunk is really the center of the Underground Railroad, and then you find the McCartys and their involvement and the Genesee Road and everything else, and you sort of start to tie this picture together that, Shunk might be this sweet, very quaint little quiet community today, but back in the 1850s, Shunk was quaint, quiet, but they were up to something. they were actively moving slaves through Sullivan County. And so we know Shunk was sort of the main focus of the Underground Railroad here. Again, going back to it, this is my favorite part of the story that I unearthed, and it's the common thread of Sullivan County. If you go around and ask everybody in Sullivan County, like, what makes Sullivan County different? What makes us special? And you hear so many people say, oh, Sullivan County is the most generous place in the world. And then you look back through the history and you find all these instances of generosity, and then you find this one, where people were expected to carry nothing because they were fugitives and they were escaping for their freedom. They'd gotten off a boat in an unknown place. They were given directions. They were winging a prayer, and yet hundreds of people were ushered through Sullivan County. We know thousands of people were ushered by Daniel Hughes to freedom, and so we can assume hundreds came the Sullivan County route. And that entire route through Sullivan County, Hillsgrove, they stopped for a day, and then they traveled on, and they got up to where we're at here in Lincoln Falls for a day, and then Shunk for a day. And so 3 days in Sullivan County with nothing, but you left with food, you left with water and directions and faith that you would get to where you needed to go if you just continued on the path that was laid out in front of you. And so that generosity that paved the way for the Underground Railroad to actually work here in Sullivan County is still largely at play here in Sullivan County today. And that's the part that when I started studying this, I was like, man, if there's any common thread that we can get out of this, it's that Sullivan County is a generous place. And that goes all the way from top to the bottom. They're generous to people who do a lot for this community, and they're generous for somebody who can't do anything for this community at all and is passing through. And today, with all the tourists that we have, not much has really changed, guys. We're still the most generous place in the world, and we're still being generous to people who are just passing through. Now, the people today aren't on their way to freedom. There's no larger goal. But we are still just helping people out on their way passing through. And so I think that, to me, was the most important part to unearth, was that common thread. Where are we now? Where were we then? And it's all still here. We still have it. And so, yeah, I was really happy to be asked to present this information. I was even more happy to research it, and my findings have made me the most happy. And so I really thank you guys for joining me this evening in a beautiful place, and being generous with cookies and ice cream afterwards. Just the same way we've always been here in Sullivan County. It just seems to be the right way to do it. Does anybody have any questions?
Can I tell you a story that my grandmother taught me? Mom, she was a McCarty that lived where the old George McCarty place is, I think it's a Hess farm now, or I don't even know if Jesus lived there, but it's on a corner that goes to Camp Brule and 154.
Okay.
The house there is where she was born and raised, and she said that her parents worked with the Underground Railroad, and a lot of them came through that house, and then from there, they went, she didn't mention Shunk, but they evidently did, and then she said they went on to Powell, most of them,
Yep.
from her place, and came into that place from Pennsdale. And so, she said she didn't work with them, but her parents did, so grandma's been, I don't know, I was a little girl, I think teenager, I'm 90 now, but I think she was a teenager, when she was, telling about what happened, that her mother had told her about it, so.
We did have Joel Molinaw brought a black man back with him from the Civil War. He was a young black boy, he was about 13, who had just been made free and had no idea what to do with his life. And he ended up in the camp that Joel Molinaw was in charge of. And Joel fed him and gave him water. And the kid basically told him, I have no idea what to do with my life now that I'm free. And so Joel brought him home. His name was, he went by Ned.
Joel Mullen?
Yep, Joel
Yeah,
Molinaw.
that's my uncle, great uncle, yes,
Yeah.
and he was in the Civil War.
Yep.
Yeah, he brought a boy home with
Yep,
him.
Ned.
I think he was 14 years old.
Something like that.
And he lived with them for a while, then they built a shack out back, and then he became, they sent him to college at, is there a Houghton College or some kind of college?
Houghton College,
He
yeah.
became an undertaker, and his
And
business
then
is
they-
the oldest black-owned undertaking business in the state of New York. And maybe you can answer this question: what happened to his house in the 1890s? Was that fire intentional or not?
What fire?
His house burned down. I found the newspaper article about it, and the fact that there was a newspaper article about it at all was surprising.
Well, Joel, the house has been there since 1801.
I mean, Ned's cabin that they built for him. Ned's cabin burned down.
Yeah, oh yeah, but I don't know when.
It was in the 1890s because I found
Yeah.
the newspaper article about it.
But then he came back, his son and grandson would have been, they came back from Buffalo to our home reunion 2 or 3 times in the late 1900s.
I heard Ned came back for
Yeah.
family reunions too,
Right, yeah.
because
So,
one of the
I
chases
got to meet them.
had a picture of being held by Uncle Ned, like their
Yeah.
father being held by Uncle Ned.
I just know.
And
That's
so,
wild.
I don't remember him, but others in the family all tell me about him.
and then another story I forgot to tell you, which was a great one, and I don't know the truth behind it, but it was a published story. There was a little girl who came downstairs, and here in Sullivan County, and she found that her parents had a fugitive slave at the table. At first, she was very frightened because she'd never seen a black person before, and so she was standoffish. But this fugitive slave was sitting at the table, and he was eating pancakes, and he was smiling ear to ear. And she looked at him and said, "Sir, why are you so happy? Have you never had a pancake before?" And he said, "Oh, I've had pancakes. I've never had syrup." So his first experience with syrup was at this house. They made him pancakes. So she put a little vial together and sent him on the way with it. Next time you have pancakes, at least have some syrup. And I thought that was really cute. That the gift that she thought to give this guy was a little vial of pancake syrup, but evidently that was the important one. Yes, sir.
The Lincoln Falls across the way here,
Mhm.
is that used as a tunnel system behind the falls?
So the owners are right over here. I believe it was. I've been told by a lot of people it was. The stories that I've heard contradict a little bit. I believe that there is a tunnel that was used for hiding fugitive slaves. What I heard more than one person has tried to tell me it was the falls themselves. You had to go behind the falls,
Right.
and then the tunnel started, and then you popped up somewhere.
Right.
And that's the part that I'm like, ooh, is that true? Because I've never even seen those falls, guys. So I don't know the truth behind that, but I've been told by a lot of people that Grandma said that my place, and today that's pretty good information. Now, what I found in the report was that Grandma said stuff. Judge Ingham probably was not involved in the Underground Railroad. He was the judge of Sullivan County. He was the DA through the 1860s. His job was to enforce the law. I don't think he was actively breaking it within sight of his neighbors. And the other one was William Mason, and William Mason's house is literally across the street from the sheriff's office. And the sheriff's office has always been on that side of the courthouse, so that didn't move. That was right across the street from the sheriff's office the whole time. So that grandma said that my parents or that my great-grandparents were involved. I think that's muddied waters with abolitionism. I think your great-grandparents being a fervent abolitionist does not necessarily mean that they were active on the Underground Railroad. You should still be proud of that heritage, but I don't think it necessarily makes you a known conductor. So what I look for as a historian is other sources. The Battens up in Shunk were Marshall Batten and Sam Batten were probably conductors. Ellen was probably a station agent. And then we have other families like the Snells in Hillsgrove that were probably conductors. I don't think we had more than one station agent in Sullivan County. I think that was all Ellen. And luckily she lived a long life. And so she was like 1800 in Sullivan County all the way past 1861 when the Civil War broke out. And so she was probably our station agent through the entire history of the Underground Railroad here in Sullivan County. And then Marshall and Reuben Batten probably worked for her in the Shunk area, and the Snells probably worked for, and by the way, all these families are related, guys, and we're way back then too. And so, but at first I was like, what is the common thread? And then I was like, oh my God, they're all related with each other. Any other questions?
So Lincoln Falls' name is derived from Lincoln Falls.
And that's in
That makes
honor.
sense that it would be a way for the slaves to.
And it was in honor of President Lincoln. This community didn't have a name until President Lincoln was elected president, and then that's when it was designated Lincoln Falls. And it was always an unincorporated village. It was just the post office that got the designation. Yes, sir.
So with the potential hostility of the authorities, how did they operate? Where did the authorities kind of more or less turn a blind eye unless it was thrown in the face?
Yeah.
So they knew what was going on, they kind of tolerated it, but...
Yeah, but tolerated it in a way that was, in newspaper articles like, we know what they're up to.
And what would be the ramifications then, like, for a
Oh,
lady?
you could
Imprisonment?
Oh, definitely imprisonment. And the fugitive slave hunters weren't very well regulated with what they could do. And so the fear wasn't necessarily getting arrested by the sheriff. The fear was the fugitive slave hunters themselves, because they were, and they could use physical violence to achieve their goal. And so they were very loosely restricted.
Was there any historical evidence of any violence?
I haven't found any in Sullivan County, but we've got lots of stories of Bradford County. There was a slave catcher crossing the Susquehanna near Wyalusing that got killed on an island. And that one was, like you said, the turn the blind eye. Even the authorities in Bradford counties were like, we never even heard of a slave catcher being here. What are you talking about? It's buried on an island? You guys, you know the name of the island? Oh, come on. Come on. It was, but EJ, when you shared that story with me, I was fascinated because I was like, wow, that close to here, there were fugitive slaves being caught and a fugitive slave catcher that was murdered, right? Kind of,
With these notable families, how did the Democrats maintain the power base to maintain the elections?
Michael Myler had a lot of money, man.
Okay.
And 33,000 acres of land. So that was, and George Jackson had money and land too. And so collectively, Michael Myler was pretty popular with the people because his dad sorted out a lot of deeds. There were a lot of ambiguities in deeds, especially through the French Asylum purchases. So northern Sullivan County had a lot of French Asylum land, and then those deeds all needed sorted out afterwards. And the Connecticut claims caused a lot of muddied waters in deeds too. And so Michael's father, C.Q. Myler, came up here and he settled a lot of those deeds. And settling the deed for the landowner that was living on the land made the Milers very popular. Because you might not have been able to take ownership of your land if that deed didn't get quieted. And so the Milers became very popular through that. So they were popular, had money, and had land. And that's how they held their hand down on power. Any other questions? Don't be shy. I've been standing up here for 45 minutes talking. You guys are allowed. Take it. If not, man. Oh.
Did Celestia play any kind of role in it?
I wanted it to so bad.
I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if it didn't.
So Peter Armstrong did found Celestia in
He
1852.
was my great-great-grandfather.
Is when his house was built there, and then some of the other houses popped up shortly thereafter. They say Celestia didn't get popular until 1861, and that's because Peter Armstrong petitioned the federal government for to not have to get drafted for immunity from the draft, and that was granted. And so Peter Armstrong, suddenly a lot of people from Philadelphia wanted to join the Celestia movement because, hey, I got drafted. I'm just going to go to this religious commune where I am suddenly undrafted. So really the only time Celestia had popularity was through the Civil War, which is, of course, after the Underground Railroad period. I wanted Celestia to be part of it so bad because all the right stuff is lined up there. He's a religious guy. He's an abolitionist. He's he's well connected in Philadelphia, and so from the outside perspective looking at it, he was one of those people that I did a lot of research into, hoping that would be the case, was that the Celestia had a relationship to it, and it's just that little bit too late for the popularity. Peter Armstrong and his family were pretty much the only ones here up until 1861. And so he was probably working really hard on building his city, not harboring fugitive slaves. But I found it unfortunate because, like I said, the connections to Philadelphia, he had his own road from Sowenstown up to Celestia, and then from Celestia up through Forestville. And so he had his own road systems. He had a village all of its own, not inside LaPorte, in LaPorte Township, but not in the borough of LaPorte, so somewhat separated from the authorities. It looked great, but I couldn't find anything that said.
Yeah, in all the research we've done that, I never came across it.
And I reached out to
It was
Wayne.
like, here's hope.
Yep, I reached out to Wayne Bender too, and I said, "What do you think?" And he said, "I don't think so." And I said, "Darn it, man!" I said, "I thought so." And he goes, "I know, the piece is all." So maybe he just, because remember, it was clandestine, and a lot of the people didn't even tell their own family that they were helping out because that was risk.
But they weren't really, it wasn't really established in enough time before.
No.
Yeah.
Now, I wish though, because that, trust me, as a LaPorte guy, I was really, I was like, that could get me into LaPorte Township at least.
Thank you.
Any
Just
other
a
questions?
quick thread, been around 50 years here in Stories. The Bethel Schoolhouse.
Bethel?
The Bethel Schoolhouse across from the old cast pallet mill.
Where's that at? I know, I've heard Bethel
I'm going to
Schoolhouse.
explain where that is. But if you go north from the Bethel Schoolhouse, you come up to the intersection where there's a church on the corner.
Yep.
And North Street goes straight
Yep.
out to Boy Scout camp.
Are you on St. Peter's and Paul?
I'm sorry?
St. Peter's and
Yes,
Paul? Yep,
yes.
yep.
I know the guy used to be pastor there. And the North Street went up to, past the church, up to Cahill and past through what's now Relay, or was Relay, into Shunk, and then on up into New York.
Yep.
But the Bethel Schoolhouse was a stopping point.
So they may have used schools, but they.
New Mountain Road, yes.
Okay, that's up at the, that makes sense. So I don't like to, public buildings probably weren't used as an actual stop. but they probably were used as a landmark.
Landmark, yeah, and
Uh,
the lady who lived in the house at the pallet mill said that her husband's family had been facilitators.
Yep, that's entirely possible. That whole Elton and Forks Township and Fox Township are the ones that I can say definitively had a lot of help on the Underground Railroad. And you know, the people that I'm saying are that I'm naming probably helped a lot of people, but then, like I said before, you know, if a pastor got information that fugitive slave catchers were coming up from Forksville tomorrow, and they were in town, they could have told, like, don't send people this way, send them a different way. So instead of going from, you know, Hillsgrove up to Lincoln Falls, they might have gone over to Forksville and stayed a night in somebody's house over there, or a day in somebody's house over there, and then gone up from there. And so, you know, the ones that I'm talking about, the Battens and the McCartys, and those are volume. That's where, you know, there's probably a lot of people passing through, but then there's a lot of other places in Sullivan County. Reverend Bedford was probably helping out in some way, and his family had, you know, 6 or 8 houses all right there around Bedford Corners. And so you can imagine that any one of those houses could have been used in an instant.
The church's address is technically Bedford Corners, as everybody knows it.
Yeah.
How did they organize?
How do they
Was it
organize?
like a national, like?
Yes, yeah, there was, yep, that was another part that I didn't know until I started doing research into it. There was a national organization, and there was a president of the national organization, and it went, I mean, they had then they had small, then they had territories, and,
Now, would they keep it like, like the local, would they be mostly cellular, like you
Yes,
would only know
yep,
who, you
yep,
wouldn't know?
yep, that's exactly right. You would try to make it so that the only people who knew, like, one conductor would know 2 other conductors, the one who was getting somebody to them,
Right.
and the one who was taking somebody from them. And they tried to keep it that small. You know, you only know about those people that you're working with, and otherwise you don't know about anybody else. And breaking the slaves up from their groups, like, that probably even happened through Sullivan County. A group of 10 could have gotten split into 2 groups of 5 in Hillsgrove, and one group of 5 could have gone up to Lincoln Falls, the other group of 5 could have gone up to Shun, and then they could have gotten split down further at those points. Because the last thing you want is one person to get caught and to sell out an entire group. And so they broke the groups up so that if one person got caught, they could honestly say, I have no idea where the rest of the people are, man. They let some people off in Sunbury, but I'm sure they're gone by now. they let me off in Pennsdale, but by the time I got up here, I don't know where anybody's at. And so that was, it was very cellular, and very, these are all the same families for a reason. You could only trust your blood.
Right.
You couldn't trust, I wouldn't tell you off the street, like, yeah, I'm an agent on Underground Railroad. You want to help out? Like, you knew who was helping. So, yes, very small groups and very sophisticated ways of passing information along, and even that was cellular. There was a group outside of Philadelphia that used quilts. They would hang a quilt off the back porch, and then they would fold and expose one particular design on a quilt, and that design would be the symbol that you would read to determine the rest of your route. And so the network was sophisticated. It was really cool.
Now, was there a concerted effort to try to unravel the whole so-called scheme, or like would the southern states have maybe employ like the Pinkertons or something to try to?
Yeah, that was the fugitive slave catchers. There was a whole industry down south where, like, if you were the second born son to a poor white farmer and you didn't stand to inherit anything, you could make a really good living catching slaves for somebody else. And so then you could, your job, instead of running family farm because you weren't going to inherit it, you could be running up to Sullivan County, Pennsylvania, to try to find Joe who escaped 6 months ago. If the information came back to the plantation saying, like, oh, we think Joe is here, they would send slave catchers there. And that's the Fugitive slave law 1850 permitted them to cross state lines, county line. I mean, there was,
Yeah.
that basically opened the door for them to kick it as hard as they wanted to. Yes, ma'am.
Was there any rendezvous point, like in Canada, like all these people that got split up, did they,
That depended on their family. If it was one family group and they got split up, they may have said, okay, we'll meet in Ontario. But that would have been up to them.
I didn't know if there
A lot of times, it was, as far as the United States was concerned, it was Niagara Falls. Go to Niagara Falls, tell them how to cross, and then you're done. Because once they're in Canada, your job is done. They're getting their papers, and they are either going to stay there. Vast majority of them did. The only ones, like I said, who came back to the United States after the experience of slavery were the ones that had wives and children here that they wanted to get out. And so they would come back and try. I can't imagine trying to make that journey twice. If you made it once, I feel like you did good enough, man. Yeah, some of them came back and tried again. And that's when they got caught. Any other questions? Is anybody as ready for cookie and ice cream? I heard these ladies here make great cookies.
I found your description of 1840s shunk really does fit. Nice folks that are up to something. I found that to be pretty accurate. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing Well, I'd like to return thanks, and then please come on downstairs. We got lots of cookies and ice cream, and we'd love you to stay. Let's pray. Father God, thank you that our area was able to be involved in different ways in bringing freedom. Jesus, we know that you came to bring freedom. It's great to hear about how our ancestors were involved in that. Thank you for Gavin coming and sharing with us. And thank you for all the cookies that have been prepared. Just bless them to our bodies. In Jesus' name, amen.
The easiest way to get downstairs is to head out and then go around and the door's on the other side. If you need to